I am now going to hand over to the person who is chairing this session. You can read his details on the bit of paper. He is Timothy Barnes. He's got the fascinating job title, Senior Deity. I guess that's a transhumanist job title if I ever heard one. Man becoming God. Having godlike, but we are much more powerful than most of the Greek gods of old ever imagined they might be, though we've still got lots of foibles too, again like the Greek gods I suppose. So founder and senior deity at the Rain Gods, and with a fascinating background, I'm sure he'll tell you a bit about bringing digital disruption to government. Please welcome Tim Barnes.
Right, well, good afternoon everybody, and welcome back to the first session of this afternoon. I tend to walk around a bit, so I'm assuming that if you're at the back, I don't need a microphone. Is that fair? Can you hear me? Brilliant. So I'm going to kick off this session, which David just described as being a little bit different from this morning. We're going to have more of a panel discussion this afternoon in this session. So get the questions going in your mind. We'll take them directly from the audience as well as online. But I want to give you a bit of a primer to start with as to some of the things that we're going to talk about. David said there's a little bit less tech in some of this session. Well, this is the transition between those two. So this is some of how we're using tech to bring about better government. And CivTech, which is the term that we're using for this particular brand, is what I'm going to talk about first, a little bit of an explanation of what we mean by the terms, and a little bit of an understanding of why it is that, quite frankly, you should care about this as an area. What is CivTech and why you should care about it? So I'm just going to start with a little bit of background to myself and the sort of remarks I'm going to make. As Dan said, I run a small business called Rain Gods. For most of the last 8-9 years, I ran the Centre for Entrepreneurship almost next door at University College London, which I started in 2007, and I grew to being the largest university entrepreneurship programme running out of any university in the world. A large number of activities around how we encourage people to start companies, how we get them to change their aspirations, how we give them direct support and so on. That was students, for staff, and for several hundred small companies each year from outside of the institution. And I left with the idea that it was great to be trying to encourage people to start businesses, but we needed to try and bring some of that dynamism, some of that change to one or two of the biggest problems that we face in our society. And that's how we sort of start off. So, the macro picture of where we begin in this particular conversation. Anybody here want to guess, roughly speaking, what the biggest industry on Earth is? And the context of this discussion is the idea that if you kind of broke the world down into maybe 14, 15 of the industries that you would think is a kind of fairly straightforward way of dividing things up, what do you think the biggest industry would be? Healthcare, farming,
being a mother and home worker.
Being a mother and home worker, not actually strictly in this industry breakdown, but that's probably the politically incorrect attitudes of the authors, about whom more in a moment. It's not my number, so I'm going to skirt around that. Tourism.
Energy.
Anybody else? Okay. Government. Oh my word! It's one of those things where this is the subject of the talk. What do you think it's going to be? Of course, it's government. Honestly, how could it have taken you? It's terrible. So I used to do presentations for students where we would talk about what are the methods of transportation that you might use as students. It would often take up to 15 minutes for them to get to walking. Anyway, government is the biggest industry on the planet in most cases. It's roughly speaking, in this kind of definition, about 16% of global GDP and 15% of all employment, and that's after you strip out the things that pretty much stand on their own as industries, including healthcare and education. So this is the business of governing. It's not about defence and how you blow things up. It's not about how you then scrape them up off the pavement afterwards, or how you necessarily take care of their long-term health needs or their education or any of the other bits and pieces. This is mostly the business of government and the things that governments do in a kind of straightforward way. And to go back to your comment earlier, this I've entirely borrowed from a McKinsey study which came out in March of this year, and so I will cite them as the authors of the politically incorrect categorisation that we might otherwise be referring to. But it's not only huge, it's also the most inefficient industry on the planet, with only 0.2% productivity growth in the last decade, more or less. that we can measure. So you've got the largest industry on the planet, where we're spending the money, where many of these people are working, and almost none of it is improving in the way that we experience other aspects of our working lives. And I'm sure you're all familiar with that, right? The number of things that you can now do on your phone, to audio shopping, to find a location, find maps, to talk about everything else you might do, and yet when it comes to things like paying taxes, voting, trying to find out what the local resources are for adult social care in your particular little corner of the land, this is almost something you will find entirely impossible to do through the things that you might have considered normal even 5 years ago in almost any other part of your life. And that leads me on to my second trick question. Which big industry do you think is most ripe for digital disruption? We'll come back to that. We'll also come back to the construction in a minute. Farming, right, we're going to come back to that. Hold those two thoughts. Hold those two thoughts. So, yes, of course it's government, otherwise this talk wouldn't make any sense. This is a large chart you won't be able to read, but I'm just using it as a kind of an illustration. This is some of the industry categorizations that McKinsey identified in this particular way of breaking down their sort of scale and their constituent parts. And the degree to which, across a number of different factors, including infrastructure, their connectedness, the level of skills, the digital assets and stock that's available, how ready each of those industries is to some form of digital disruption, to being open, to being serviced and supported by digital infrastructure. And at the top, not entirely surprisingly, you've got the ICT industry itself, media, professional services, finance and insurance. And as you go down, you've effectively got industries that have mostly already undergone a fairly significant degree of digital disruption. Right? The things that we've just talked about, the things that even if you don't think about it in those terms, you would immediately be able to recognise. Who here right now does their supermarket shopping online on their phone or on a web browser? Okay. Probably about a third of the room. Banking? Okay, that's pretty high. I don't know, that might be 80% of the room. So, professional services, finance right up there, and the rest. Down the bottom, and here you're going to go with me on this, the bottom one turns out to be agriculture and farming, or this being an American publication, agriculture and hunting, which is all red and not right for digital disruption because it's pretty hard to digitize a cow and still get milk from it. So there are parts of farming and agriculture you can quite clearly bring some form of digital transaction to, very much in the overhyped terminology of the Internet of Things. Yes, you can do things to track livestock. Yes, you can do a whole lot of other bits and pieces, but the fundamentals of it make it pretty hard. The interesting bit is this kind of area here. Because these are the bits where the digital bit hasn't really happened yet, but it's not basically impossible. And number one across that list is this bit, government, where the red bits of can't do have started to change to yellow and amber, and are starting to make things possible. And you'll recognise that if you think about what has happened to financial services over most of the last decade. Anybody here worked in financial services? Okay. So I spent some time working a few years ago for a small tech company that was looking to do reconciliation of trade transactions in foreign exchange derivatives between major banks, right? And that's really dull. But the point of it was that as a business, it was an incredible thing. JP Morgan was the largest bank in this particular sector, and even transacting trillions of dollars a day of trade values. And at some points, 60% of all transactions between banks in a multi-trillion-dollar industry failed. 60%. So every time they thought they'd carried out a sale where one bank had spoken to another bank and said, we've agreed to sell this derivative, we're lodging it in this country, we're doing it on this day, this is the price it's being paid, this is the volume, 60% of the time, the message would come back going, well, hold on a minute, you can't do that. Either because it turns out you've tried to book this in a country where there was actually a public holiday, or because you said it was 100,000, we thought it was 110,000, or whatever. These kind of things don't happen in that way anymore, but the needs of the banks are pretty similar to many of the needs of government. There's a relatively small number of very large players with huge amounts of value per transaction and very large and significant security concerns. There are issues around big data, there are issues around all the things that make financial services interesting that are affecting these. And we've solved many of those problems, as you've just kindly illustrated, without even being paid, by pointing out that 80% of the room has carried out some kind of finance activity online. And yet that isn't what's happening to government. So CivTech, in reference to things to do with civil society and civic society, is that kind of crossover, like a fintech, but it's how is tech going to make that work? And this is a new area. When fintech started as a term, as a thing, nobody entirely knew whether it included insurance. So insurance, and insurtech or insutech, at times was defined out of it. Was a thing that didn't really, an area of the market that wasn't really there. CivTech, GovTech, Civic Tech, these are all kinds of different flavours of where this has got to in an industry that's not yet mature enough to have an accepted set of definitions. So some of what I will kind of summarise them for is to say that whichever of these three terms you use, it's all about using tech to deliver better government. Better use of government data to make things happen and to inform the public. Better use of tech to encourage the interactions between governments and their citizens, or between governments. Better delivery of public services. All of those kind of things where we're using tech to do a better job of governing, being governed, and holding your governors to account. All of those things fall under the kind of definitions that we're using. They're slightly nuanced terms, but the short answer and the way that we're going to talk about this for the rest of this session is CivTech is basically the startups trying to do these things, and that's mostly for-profit startups trying to bring about some of those kind of activities in the way that many of the things Curve and other recent companies have done in fintech. So they're typically startups. GovTech tends to be the big companies doing these things, typically large companies selling cloud services to government or multi-billion-dollar contracts that startups can do. And Civic Tech, very close, is often this kind of social organisations that are trying to bring around campaigns, establishing different ways of thinking, pushing people and getting them to think differently, but not necessarily running the services. The UK is relevant in all of this because this right now is probably the best place in the world to be trying to deliver civic tech, or CivTech rather. It's one of the best places where you could be trying to do this. Lots of reasons for that. First off, the raw materials are here in greater supply than almost anywhere else. We've got the startups, the startup capital, the technical skills, the machine learning, the AI, the big data, all the things that we did with fintech to make that work. So we're doing great with the raw materials. We've also got customers and startups in the same location. Right? Anybody here ever tried to work in Washington, DC? Right, a little bit. Anybody familiar with the startup scene in DC? There isn't one, because there is no real other industry in DC other than government, right? Jason, who's on a bit later on, you should definitely study here, by the way, is a fantastic example of somebody who's trying to crack that. Indeed, the biggest concentration of startup in the US is in California, about as far away from government as it could possibly be. And indeed, the only person that they've managed to find to send back as an ambassador for the tech community to DC in the new administration is Peter Thiel, and that in itself would be an example of why this is a terrible disconnect. But London is uniquely positioned as a global startup hub with the ability to carry out local, regional, national, international, and transnational government in one place. There are not many places you can do this. There are some. You could do something in Asia. Turns out that the pro-democratic bits of some of the things we're talking about don't go down quite as well in some of our potential Asian trading partners as they do in the UK. So you've got a great sense of possibility here. UK is also pushing out more data than any of the big economy countries from what's taking place. I think called the D5 or the Digital 5, which is a coalition of big economies trying to do that kind of thing. And we're pretty committed to engaging with small companies as a government, with £1 in £3 of central government spending to be spent with SMEs by 2020, which realistically is not very far away. And we quite simply right now don't know how to do that. So we've got all of these wonderful things as part of the raw material, and our objective in bringing it all together is in a new co-working space that I've set up in Victoria, so it can be close to government, called the Rain Cloud Victoria, because rain clouds are where rain gods live. There you go. So it's the marketing events we have called the rain dances, because that's what we do when we want to call a rain god down. And it's a co-working space where we brought several of these nascent elements of this community together to make something happen. So these are some of the organisations that we've got involved, and critical to all of these right now is this company called Meganexus, and some of our first members. Critical to this right now is a company called Represent. And I'm going to ask you if you wouldn't mind putting your hands together to welcome Kathryn Corrick and Dan Brown together, who represent and Meganexus for our panel. Please. So, Kathryn, check this on stage. So we have a one microphone to pass along and share between us as we go, and hopefully we're not going to get doubts on the projector side anyway. So I'm just going to ask these guys to spend a couple of minutes presenting a little bit about themselves. We'll explain a little bit about what their businesses do, a little bit about themselves, and about how they're trying to bring some form of digital disruption to government. So, Kathryn.
You remember that now?
Just about.
Yeah. Right. So my name's Kathryn. My name's Kathryn. I won't do that. No. There we go. Yeah. My name's Kathryn. And gosh, I was thinking when you were talking about disruption, Tim, about one of the first experiences I had of what you now term maybe CivTech, what maybe just termed new media at the time, and back in 2001. And I was working for the New Statesman at the time. I was their online manager and editor, so I was in this weird role of doing technology, editorial, and business. It was great. But we ran this thing called the New Media Awards, and one of our first winners was Fax Your MP. I'll repeat that again. Fax Your MP.
That's F-A-X, not F-A-C.
Yeah, today it probably would be Facts for Your MP. But drum roll there. And I think what was also interesting at that point as well, there was only 15 councils with a website. And the reason that Fax Your MP had to happen, and the way it worked is you went to the website, you put in the details of the fax you wanted to send to your MP, because most people didn't have a fax machine. Whoa! But all the MPs did. So you could then, via your web browser, actually send a fax to your MP, and they kind of had all the fax numbers. Now, to me, that says a lot about how far we've come in 15 years. Now, if you send an MP a fax, I think they kind of look at you. They may not even have a machine anymore, and hopefully it's connected to an email, even if they do. And now we've got the opposite problem, where MPs now have too many things in their inboxes. I heard Stella Creasy the other day say that since 2011, all the petition emails that she hasn't looked at and go straight into a folder. So we're actually now at the opposite kind of end of the problem. And so what Representatives are trying to do is begin to solve some of that, where rather than have all these emails coming in, and MPs really now are finding that weight of all the communications happening to them really difficult to manage. So one of the things we're trying to do is, instead of sending your MP an email, you can begin to collate data, oh my goodness, that tells them a little bit more about what their constituents think. And gives them far more ways for both them and the constituents to begin a better, deeper relationship around what should be happening, what's happening in their area, how it could be better, getting ideas, that sort of thing. So Representatives lots of things, but that's one of the things we're trying to kind of improve, is that connection between individuals and their representatives.
So just before you hand it on, Kathryn, do you want to just say a little bit? So we've got this is just the front screenshot of the Represent site for a logged-in user.
Nationalise the railways. Of course, you chose that one.
Well, I did actually just go. So this is my page on Represent. That's my very wonderful picture of it. And these are maybe the first things that came up today when we got in. So you just want to talk a little bit about how this works and what people see and what the end users might see.
So the way it's a very, very simple format that anyone can ask and answer a question, and then we show the data around it and how representative those answers are. So I don't know if you've got control of this at all.
Not in
Can I go over there and I'll answer a question for you?
You can. At the moment, this is just a static image, so let me.
So,
we can turn it to a browser in a minute.
if Tim kind of pressed one of those buttons and answered the question, what would immediately happen is he'd get them the results of so far who thinks that railway should be renationalised. And then what we are able to do is go bury right down to council ward level to see who thinks that that's the case, and also what age groups think that should happen or shouldn't happen, and by what gender. So you can begin to create a much closer relationship between what you think in a local area with any decision maker.
So we've actually got a less helpful one that's come up first. But,
so this then can be applied, this very simple mechanism of being able to ask, answer and show the data can then be used in multiple ways. So if you think how often you would ask a question in a day, and it's just the question is the unit, you then gives you just some ideas of how many different uses this technology can have. We've also got Facebook-like technology where we have groups, so which can be public or private. So if you want to make decisions within a group or an organisation, publicly or privately, you can do so. And also get insights in real time on what's going on. So it is very different to a survey or a poll, or even a petition, because what petitions and polls are trying to do, particularly petitions, is who agrees. And it never really counts who disagrees, or who thinks it's just a rubbish question, or thinks it could be better, or has an idea. And so we're trying to get away from that very binary way of looking at things to actually look at things more holistically.
So if you took an example like in somebody saying, I don't like this building that needs to go up locally, and they're trying to vote against planning, you can find out why, and it may be something you can address and actually come to a conclusion where everybody. So actually, I like it because the design sucks, not because I'm against the building itself or whatever it might be.
I mean, if anyone want a nice example of how this can be used for government, we've currently got a consultation with on schools. So if you go to see where it says collections there, go to collections, scroll down, and we've also got one on Heathrow, go down to the schools, and what we've done is we've put the consultation first of all into plain English so that anyone can answer the questions. So rather than reading a 36-page document and taking about an hour to vaguely even try to understand any of it, we've put those into very simple questions, so then it takes about 8 minutes to try and give government some better ideas about how school policy in England should happen, and also widened out what those policy ideas could be. So there's lots and lots of ways it can be used.
Brilliant, thank you. So we'll hand over to Dr. Dan Brown. So Dan is the founder and chairman of Meganexus, and if a company like Represent is one of the up-and-coming new companies representing civic, Meganexus is actually a company that's been trying to do this before anybody really knew it was a thing. It's been around for about 10 years, and is an example of the fact that UK can do this. We'd just like to see more of these companies growing here and growing faster. But Dan, tell people a little bit about Mega.
Okay, as Tim was saying, about 10 years ago, I was brought into UCL as entrepreneur in residence, and I was struck as what that was all about. It was about sort of taking technology and using innovation to create businesses that could do things out in the real world, and I've struggled for ages. About 2 weeks ago, I suddenly realised what my real role was, and it's to make academia great again. So that's what we've been doing. We started Meganexus at UCL Computer Science. It's gone through a whole load of iterations and trials and tribulations, which Tim has seen. But today, it's a flourishing business. It employs 100 people. It's focused on justice, healthcare, and community. Its goal is to create technology to help people get better, which is all about the journeys of vulnerable people, to support those vulnerable people to do better in their lives, whether it's to become healthier patients or for ex-offenders in particular, to be rehabilitated into the community. And a big focus of what we do at Meganexus is work with the justice sector, working with the Ministry of Justice and the National Offender Management Service. And there we now support in 105 prisons, which is basically just about every prison in England and Wales, and a quarter of the country's probation service. We have our technology, which is enabling people in the justice system to get access to materials around the 7 or 9 pathways, which are education, training, employability, healthcare pathways, so that people can get access to education, jobs, materials for self-development in the widest sense, so they can get better. And that's often online in prison. And at about sort of 6 years ago, getting online web services into prisons was deemed just about impossible. Now it's the drive, and the key focus that we have currently is in cell, because if somebody is in cell all day, they might as well be doing something that's productive. The cost of an offender reoffending varies from £40,000 to £140,000 per year per person. If you add that up, 10 people is £1 million plus a year. So the numbers are absolutely enormous. And what we're looking to do all the time is operate across 3 areas. The first is direct contact with a service user. The second is support for a case manager to case manage all the information and data around that individual. And the third area is program management and collating the data so that better interventions programs can be provided, so that the right sectors, the right cohorts of people can be targeted with the most relevant materials that can support them best on their journeys. And we're really, although Tim said, this has all happened over the last 10 years, we're still at the beginnings of the technology and learning journey. In particular, I think data, machine learning, all of these things that everybody's been talking about for several years now are starting to become real. As Tim said, they're starting, some of the capabilities are being taken from the financial sector, from the sort of supermarket sector and other areas, and put into government. And the changes that we're able to make now are absolutely vast. And I think overall, if we can do this for offenders, the most vulnerable and difficult group of people we can work with generally in society, I think we can do it for anybody, and there are massive opportunities currently available, so look forward to discussing it today.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So Dan, hold on to the conch for the moment, and we're going to see if anybody's got any questions in the audience, and also come back to David for 1 or 2 online. So let's start with the gentleman with his hand up there. Feel free to shout out and I'll repeat it if people can't hear.
Thanks, very interesting set of presentations. There's an implicit assumption in what you're saying that throwing technology at government will make it more productive. But all the data we see from pretty much the entire planet shows that throwing the trillions of dollars we've thrown at organisations in the last 20 years have actually seen a decline in productivity sector by sector. So what is it about government that you think doing the same thing with them, we're going to get remarkably better results from a group that's been resistant to using technology? What is it about government that it's going to give us those productivity gains that we haven't seen anywhere else?
So I think that this is a basic thing. Why do we think that, to use your term, throwing tech at government is necessarily going to make it more productive when it hasn't happened anywhere else? Well, leaving aside the background to that, I'd say that there's several things that we're trying to do here. Some of it's fundamentally trying to help government to be more productive in the way that you might normally measure the kind of economic factors and so on. But if you listen straightforwardly to both the examples of Kathryn and Dan's perhaps immediately most obviously, there's also a job here which is about doing the bit you don't immediately measure by adding up the combined turnovers of these businesses or the numbers of people employed. For every case of helping somebody who is in prison to get a job that works pretty much at the time at which they leave, their chances of reoffending drop by something huge, like 80% or something, right? Yes, and so it's not just that economic value that we've captured in running the prison service more effectively, it's lower crime, it's lower recidivism rates.
But you
what is the benefit of
putting a psychologist into prisons where you have a massive impact on decreasing recidivism, and you're not putting technology going? It's not.
Okay, so on that specific example, Dan is a psychologist. That's what his PhD was in, and that is the person we put into prisons. And this is one of the ways they came up with doing that.
Let me give you one example, then I'll pass the conch, as it were. But with offenders in prison, one of the highest causes for recidivism is people preventing recidivism, is getting people into a job, and getting a job is really challenging. And what we're able to do is have people learn in a prison environment, in a virtual campus, as it's called, suite, or in a cell. And those people, it can take 2 weeks or more to turn around their materials, which they had to previously send by post to a tutor, for the tutor to reply, for the work to be marked, whereas now that can happen instantly. They can apply instantly online for a live job, and people have been allowed out on a day release to go to a job interview, and then come back, and on release people we've had go directly into jobs. That is a difference of people spending 6 months in prison doing nothing versus people spending 6 months in prison and having a job when they leave. And I was at one event in London, the Royal Society of Arts, and there were all sorts of great and good, and Michael Gove was there in his heyday. And there was a guy in a grey tracksuit, and I've been talking about the virtual campus, this product in the prisons. He was clearly an offender just about to be released. And I went up to him and I said, "Have you heard of the virtual campus?" And he looked at me, and he saw that I was, I needed to be looked after, and he went, "Yeah, it's effing marvellous." And I was hugely relieved. And he then went on to talk about it and the difference it had made. And it was very rewarding for me, because I could see that it had made a difference to him and a number of other people who were there. And I think, I have to say respectfully that I disagree about technology having made a difference in productivity and wider society. I think it's made an enormous difference, and that's a backdrop, as Tim suggested. But in terms of what we're able to do, with the inefficiencies in the prison environment in particular, where it can take weeks for an individual to communicate with the outside world, and it can now be done in a matter of seconds, that is life-changing for people in prison.
I think that there's a number of things in this issue, and what is it that we mean by productivity, going back to what both Tim and Dan have said. But I know for us, what we're trying to do is help with better decision making. So often what happens with why things haven't been as productive is sometimes along the line in a procurement process, in a way that technology has been thought that it might solve the problem. It hasn't actually been thought through right from the word go. And often what you've had is replicating an analog process into a digital process, which actually hasn't been necessary, and not taking the benefits of digital or of the new technology and how that could actually genuinely improve something. Flipping that over, the other thing we're also struggling with is, well, how, now that we have better processes, now that there is more automation, how do people live with that? We're now, we have now a country where we've had a lot of industrialization for a very long time, and now people are having to work, they're having to work less because there are less jobs, and we're now beginning to think differently about, well, what the policies we need around that. Do we need to be thinking about basic income? Do we need to be thinking differently about work and jobs? So I think that there's many sides to this, but for us, what we're trying to do is better help create better decisions in the first place.
David, do you want to take one from there, and then we'll take another one?
Well, there are questions about represent here as well, which maybe just dovetails into what we're discussing. So one of the top questions is, how do you ensure that represent doesn't just become a lobbying tool for one particular faction because of its kind of presuppositions or any loaded language?
Absolutely, and I think that's really, really, really important. And one of we've got various ways that we try and tackle that. I don't know if you asked the question. So on a basic level, it's why we show the data, right from where going. If you go to most petitions, if you go to a lot of the sites that are out there, they won't be transparent. They won't be open about the responses that they've received. So that's number one. Number two is we also then, whilst we want to balance privacy and also openness, so anyone can actually join the site anonymously, but what we do is we reward people who are trying to prove that they're a real person. So the more information you give us, and it is your information, I should have said that right at the start, it's your data, you have the copyright over it, you have the controls over your privacy, that we can then show by some of the, how reliable these responses are, where they come from, and we will be continuing to try and show and improve on that, basically, because we don't want lobbying. We're actually an kind of lobbying kind of organisation.
Can I just say the question was more oriented around the 38 degrees approach,
right, okay.
which is an organisation who's purported to be relatively independent, but actually transparently seem to be quite a lobbying group.
Right.
And certainly many of the questions that come through now are, we need you to help us fight this, NHS, whatever it might be. So it's become a sort of self-congratulatory, it's become quite a powerful tool in lobbying government, but it's definitely a sort of left-wing lobbying group rather than an independent decision-making assistant.
So we are trying our best, and we need everyone to help us do that, and keep independent. What the people who have joined so far are tending towards being from the southeast, but we've got 57 countries represented. We can actually show how wide their views are, because that's what we do. And they are tending towards being left and liberal and socially liberal. However, we are transparent about that, and we are trying to have relationships, as Tim will definitely know, with all the different parties. We're in conversation with from UKIP to the Greens to independents like James, who's about to speak, and we're trying to make sure we really represent the people, because we know that as this year has shown, that really hasn't been happening.
Let's take the gentleman in the jumper here. Yep.
Yes, this strikes me as a good chasing the bad. You're the good, you're chasing bad government. I mean, a lot of the structures in government, from healthcare to education, probably the way we deal with the criminals, and the fact that politics itself, they're just voting for. And there's some experience last week where they're just voting for. They're not doing anything that's very useful. I mean, we don't need politicians, I don't think, to run a lot of the big departments. We want clever people running them. Politicians are sort of, half-trained social scientists come up and suddenly run massive departments. So why don't we go and get the fundamentals of government to help improve that? Because it just strikes me as you're taking this bad load of stuff and just working with it.
If my founder was here, he would come up to you and give you a big hug, because that's exactly what we're trying to help. We're trying to get that knowledge. So one of the features I haven't mentioned is around its delegation. So people who know that they themselves might not be able to say whether we should or shouldn't renationalise the railways, but they might know someone who's an expert in transport who will know the ins and outs of some of that policy. And one of the things you can now do on the site is copy the vote. So it's like, right, I trust you to know about this. So and begin to have a trusted network. So and that can be used for two things. Usefully, if you are in government, you then know who to bring into the room, who is an expert in a particular area, and who has a body of people who believe and trust in them. And you can also begin to change these discussions exactly in the way you're saying.
Okay.
And that's how it's
just fine, but you're also consulting the public. The public are dreadfully educated. What makes you think they're any authority on whether the railway network should be nationalised or not?
I actually think that if you're questioning the government and you're questioning the people, there's no one left.
But this is a very, I should say, this is the most popular question. We have 11 people in the audience who said that recent events, for example Brexit, seem to show that voters are generally poorly informed and not well placed to decide on complex issues. So,
can I say that you're all voters?
Yeah, but we don't know what nationalising the railways means.
Okay, so
What's the model?
Sorry, what's the model? There's many questions here. So,
It's a relevant term is ochlocracy. Now, for a long time I've gone around saying what we have is a mobocracy. It turns out the Greeks knew all about this and defined the term ochlocracy 2,000 odd years ago. It's when the populace cease to be interested enough in or care enough about educating themselves about the issues and become voting fodder. And it's a very, very difficult situation to engineer your way out of, because of course the Trumps and the Goes and whatever can manipulate it much better than anyone with a conscience can.
So let's just explore that for a second and draw some of the parallels between the Brexit vote and the Trump vote. You may well say, and it was the murmur of this room, that was in some way a failure of democracy, because the guys, the Brexit vote, didn't actually know necessarily what it was they were doing or the consequences of the decision they were taking. And I think that for some people, that may very well be true. But put yourself in their shoes for a moment. There are a large number of people, millions of people in the UK, tens of millions of people in the United States, who basically just think their life is shit. And the rest of us didn't do enough about that. And that is a huge failure of communication. Not just a communication with government, but between different elements of society. Why is it that you voted to leave the European Union? Regardless of whether or not anybody here thinks it's a good idea, why did people do that? How do we come to unpick that? If it is the case that out of 17 million people in the UK, 10 million people voted to leave the European Union to achieve some form of improvement in their lives, where actually what we're going to do is the opposite of what they wanted to see happen, which is a relatively common strand of kind of metropolitan liberally branded kind of activity these days, then actually it was a failure to understand that, or a failure to communicate it, that cuts both ways. Tools like this that enable us to say, actually, here's what some of the consequences might be. You don't trust this person because they're badged as an expert. What about these people? How do you do that? Where do you go down this road? If you want to have a better informed electorate, do something to make it easier to inform them, to communicate with them. And meanwhile, to the previous question, this isn't a binary choice. This is not about saying, how do we improve the electoral system, and whether or not it's government that's doing it or people that's doing it, and meanwhile, kick around and leave the other things going on. We can do something to improve the services that we have while we're working on improving the other parts of this. And that's some of what we've got represented here. This is about how we collectively, in a series of maybe 1,000 cuts, whatever it might be, and I mean, 1,000 cuts in the sense of 1,000 cuts, not necessarily budget cuts, improve one step at a time all of the elements of the biggest element that affects our lives, over which many people are currently experiencing an incredible amount of frustration about what they're doing, why other people don't think their way, and just because everybody in their social circle thinks in one particular direction, they assume the rest of the country does, and they don't really realise how absolutely fractured we are, and what a really low level of understanding you need to have, and how granular this has all become.
Hi, I'm David Bent. Amongst other things, I'm an associate fellow for science and policy in Cambridge. I guess part of what I hear here, I don't want to rehearse the Brexit conversation, by the way, but it's interesting to compare your definition of CivTech, which was all about using technology to deliver better government, and the conversation we're having now is all about better politics. And I wonder whether, as in our interaction within society, out of which we choose a government that then does stuff for us. And I just wonder, is there a difference, therefore, between the role of someone like Meganexus, which is about taking vulnerable people along pathways within government services, compared to Represent Me, which feels much more about, or is that potentially much more about the nature of the political interaction we have across society?
I'll quickly, so politics and government are related,
sure.
Right? And to try and divorce the two is a really dangerous thing, because how the way that the political process works and the way decision-making process works, it starts with, there is no particular one decision, one kind of starting point. It could be a letter that you write to your MP that changes a policy, or it can start at government level. The two correlate. So I think to try and separate the two and say we want better politics without wanting better government, I think is a really, or vice versa, is a bit tricky. But you'll be able to answer that far more than mine on the services point of view.
Well, I think the one thing I'd like to say is that, sort of alluding to what you just asked in an earlier point, is that should we be the people taking on some of the reins of government. And I think absolutely not. People like me, we're tool makers, and we should get better and better and better, and more expert, and potentially dedicate my life to making the best tools available. But government is different, because government is about change and a democratic process being able to eliminate people in power and eliminate so-called experts. And I think people like me should be given the reins to get better and better and better, but people in power need to be better and better and then wiped out and moved on. And I think there's a fundamental difference in process and how that process of power should be managed by the people.
We take a question from Ben.
Yeah, just I think I disagree with the thing about you can't separate that to what you described is great, but I think it would be helpful if all the brilliant people who are involved in civil tech, sales, people like government digital service, people like FutureGo, I think wrap all these things up together, that they're all just problems that can be solved in different ways by technology. But I think there's something fundamentally different from using better technology to help someone navigate a care pathway, which is about business process. And there are lots and lots of other things we can draw from the rest of the economy about improving business process through technology. But when it comes to involving people in decision making, I think that is a fundamentally different thing we haven't got anything to draw on. And kind of conflating, kind of using technology and nudge and behavioural economics to kind of like tweak a pathway to make that process better, and then thinking that extends to it's therefore just as easy to get people involved in these kinds of decision making and resource allocation, when there's some real big problems around information literacy, the completely haphazard distribution of digital information, whether it's reliable or completely fake. Conflating those two things rather than consciously separate them out, I think is a big problem. And I've got a heart for social science, polytechnic and intellectual, because I'm a terrible person.
So let me just there's nothing about that CV that suggests you're a terrible person. In fact, you're very welcome to come and work in our space, really. So is actually, and it relates slightly to David's previous point. This is not meant to be an academic congress where we discuss the nature of the definition to reach some form of intellectual purity. Right? There are plenty of ways in which you can cut this in different directions. The reason why some of these guys are grouped together in the way they are is not because those things aren't different. I definitely wouldn't try and say that in all aspects they're the same. But one of the ways in which we are that we have grouped these is about how we can support them to make that change happen. How we can actually, what can we do is to group together the organisations that have some commonalities in the way that the organisations need to be built out, the way that they are generating the income to be able to sustain themselves, the nature of those organisations, using particularly the vehicle of small startup companies, in order to be able to develop and deliver those. So actually, in a sense, it's a practical accumulation of those resources, rather than necessarily the one that we were drawing conclusions. Yes, those things are very separate, but the methods we can use to reach improvement in those two areas can have some commonality, and that's what we're trying to bring the resources together to do here.
Tim, we're almost out of time. I'd like all of you to have a chance to have some final words. And if you want, there's one question which I don't think has been directly addressed yet, which is quite highly voted, which is how do governments really add value to society? We're talking about improving governance. And this is what the business modelling always says, understand what the value it really is. So you may want to address that, or any other final thoughts from each of you, and then we'll have to wind up.
Dan, you've got the conch. Do you want to start?
I wish I didn't. I think from my perspective, I think I agree a little bit with what was said earlier as before. I think we are tool makers. Tool makers can make better tools, but there's still people in power need to determine how those are played out. And I think that is quite important, that we can make maybe the process of running government more efficient, but the methods of how power is wielded and managed need to be very carefully adjusted, if at all.
So the question was, how does government add to society?
Yes. Why do we have governments? What are the key things they're doing?
That's like A-level kind of discuss.
I think it's very practical. If we spend time optimising the wrong thing, we make something work faster, but it doesn't actually deliver a better product. It's core to lean thinking. know your value flow.
So there's many ways to understand government, right? And also there are many different models of government. We happen to have a fairly centralised government, which taxes are mostly distributed by central government down to local level. So it also goes to what kind of government we're talking about here and how those benefits happen. The idea, the concept of taking taxes from a populace is that everyone can benefit. So that if you've got rural areas which have less money than centralised populous areas which have more money, you can benefit the whole. And that's one of the main concepts of not just government, but how taxes can work. Governments themselves are about also protecting people. Now you can consider that protection in many different ways. So mostly it was military and defence, but that's come down to now protecting individuals on a kind of from a social care basis, or from a how is that young person going to be protected? So what are the benefits of society? Multiple, but I guess it's questioning, always going back to how can we best do that, rather than questioning government per se.
And final words, Timothy?
So I'm going to combine two unoriginal thoughts here and see if I can just use those to underline a final position. And the first is, it doesn't really, does anybody here think that we shouldn't be trying to improve government? That we shouldn't. One person thinks we shouldn't be trying to improve government. So as a society, we should not really be trying to improve government. Now, that doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter what you think where we should do. The only conclusion to draw really from saying we shouldn't be doing that is that you're pretty happy with roughly where things are, because otherwise anything else is what in your mind would be an improvement. And so it doesn't really matter what it is you're going for. You may well agree that wherever it is you want to go, you wouldn't choose to start from here, right? That's perfectly fair. All we're trying to do, whether it's in using the kind of service delivery tools that Dan's talking about, or trying to understand what it is that a very large number of people with highly varying views might want, and what we can do to amalgamate those into some kind of general consensus, whatever those things might be, that's the sort of thing that Kathryn is working on. And until such time as we've come up with something which everybody agrees is an improvement on the basic kind of democratic model that we've got, in a kind of Churchillian, we'd take every other, we'd absolutely throw out democracy until we've looked at what all the other alternatives might be. This is it. This is the idea of just trying to bring about an improvement across the board. And unless you are the one, with respect to no criticism at all, the one individual in the room who doesn't think we should be trying to improve government, that means that we are united here in a common cause. So there was, just up on the screen until Dave pulled the plug out, our Twitter handles and other things. I'm sure we'd all be happy to continue the conversation and the debate with the hashtag is it LON, it's London Future 16, LONFUT 16?
LONFUT.
LONFUT, so drop 16. Continue those, and if we can answer those questions, and the other people who had their hands up, sorry we didn't get to you, happy to try and answer those by Twitter if we can, and those will be the rest of our contact details. But thank you very much, enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and thank you for coming back after